Father, I pray this morning that you would give us wisdom as we look into your word. By your Spirit, illuminate us so that we understand what you have to say. And fill our hearts with joy in knowing that you are a God who sees, a God who cares, a God who loves. In Jesus' name, amen. Today is a great example of a sermon in a series that corresponds remarkably well to the holiday that we happen to be celebrating on the same time. In today's passage, Genesis 16, we're going to encounter a woman being mistreated, at least in part, because of her motherhood. Furthermore, we're going to see an interaction between this mother and the Lord, where he demonstrates his care and his compassion for her and for her child. In this, I hope that we will be able to see God's care and concern for mothers and their children, which of course is a very fitting message for Mother's Day, isn't it? Not only that, though, I hope we will see the particular mother in view in this story, and we'll see the fact that it's not Sarai, later renamed Sarah, the wife of Abraham, who we might consider a major character in the story, but rather it's a woman named Hagar, who we might be inclined to think of as a minor character in the overall story of redemption. But what we're going to see is that in God's economy, there are no minor characters. What we're going to see is that in God's story, there are no minor characters. He sees and he cares for each of us, and he uses each of us in his plan. So, if you're struggling today to think of yourself as more than just a minor character, if you're wondering whether or not you're important to God, if he cares for you, if you're a mother who's looking for support and encouragement in your role, or if you're someone who's hurting and wondering if God sees, my hope is that this morning you'll allow the Lord to speak to you through this passage and realize that for you too, you are not a minor character. There are no minor characters in God's story. He sees and cares for each of us, and he uses each of us in his plan. So with that in mind, let's look at Genesis 16. I'm going to put the verses up here on the screen. You can follow along in your Bibles. I'm going to read the entirety of the chapter. It's only 16 verses. Listen to the word of the Lord. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all of his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. This is the word of the Lord. There are no minor characters in God's story. God sees and cares for each of us, and He uses each of us in His plan. In recent weeks, we have been looking at the story of Abraham, and we've been seeing God's promises to Abraham, how God's using Abraham, and in particular, how God is advancing through Abraham His promise to eventually bring into the world some offspring of the woman who would finally crush the head of the serpent, the promise that we saw all the way back at the beginning of the story in Genesis chapter 3. And we've seen recently how in God's promises to Abraham, there's more information given about that promise, that it would be not just any family or any person, but it would be somebody born into the family of Abraham himself who would fulfill that promise of God. And these are some of the things that we've been seeing in the story of Abraham. We did kind of a survey of several chapters of Genesis a couple of weeks ago, and then we paused to slow down and look at some stories in more detail. Last week we looked at the story of Melchizedek a couple of chapters earlier in Genesis, and today on Mother's Day we're looking in more detail at this story in Genesis chapter 16. And then next week we're jumping ahead to Genesis 18 and 19 and seeing how the story progresses from there. As we look at this story of Hagar and her interaction with the Lord there in the wilderness, we're going to see, I hope, God's heart of concern for His people and how it inspires a heart of compassion for us. Those are our 2 points that we're going to be looking at today. There are no minor characters in God's story. Hagar is not a minor character. You are not a minor character. Consider that and give thanks to God. First of all, look at the heart of concern that we see in God as He reveals it in this story. Chapter 16 starts with this statement that Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. In the context, we understand that to be a problem, don't we? We saw how God had promised that Abram, as he's called here, would be the father of a multitude of people. In Genesis chapter 12, the original covenant, the thing that we call the Abrahamic covenant, God promised that Abraham would be the father of a great nation. And more specifically, in Genesis chapter 15, He told Abraham that his descendants would outnumber the stars of the heavens. And so Abraham has these promises in his mind, but Genesis 16 starts with this fact that Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. And from a human perspective at least, that's a problem. It's at least troubling, puzzling, isn't it? And that leads, of course, to the situation that follows. Sarai and Abram have recourse to a scenario which was common in the Old Testament world, in the ancient world. Sarai takes her personal servant, her female servant, and gives her to Abram as a wife. This was a common thing in the ancient world. We see Abraham's grandson and his wives doing the same thing. Remember Jacob and his wives Rachel and Leah, they have recourse to the same situation. They give their handmaidens to Jacob as wives in order to bear children. The idea is that since the female servant belongs to Sarai, her children will also belong to Sarai. That's kind of the way their thinking goes. And sure enough, at least from a human perspective, this plan seems to work. Abram takes Hagar as a wife, she conceives, and as soon as she conceives, we read this interesting statement in verse 4, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And there, from the Israelites' perspective, as they would have read this story in the wilderness on their way to Canaan, there's the main problem in the story. Hagar looks with contempt on her mistress. And so then there's a conflict, as we read, between Sarai and Abram eventually washes his hands of it and says, Sarai, you do what you think is best. And Sarai treats Hagar harshly in retaliation for this contempt that she has poured on her mistress, and as a result, Hagar runs away. And that's the story as far as verse 6. Now, as we think about this story, we have to avoid a couple of mistakes. The first mistake is of reading this story through the lens of 21st century sexual and marital ethics. It is true that by the light that we have today, by the grace of God, And by the illumination of the New Testament, it is true that when we read this story, we can understand this action by Abram to be a form both of marital unfaithfulness and even sexual abuse. However, it would be a mistake to judge Abram and Sarai by those standards without a very healthy measure of grace. They were products of their time. No one in Abram's time would have understood this action to be a form of marital unfaithfulness or sexual abuse. Abram would not have seen it that way. Sarai would not have seen it that way. Hagar would not have seen it that way. That's not how they thought. So as we think about this, we shouldn't be too judgmental. We have to use a healthy measure of grace. They are a product of their time. So that's one mistake we have to avoid. But that leads to the second mistake that we have to avoid too. The second mistake that we have to avoid is to try to absolve them of all wrongdoing because they're a product of their time. That would also be a mistake. Abram and Sarai are guilty of wrongdoing. Abram is guilty of marital unfaithfulness, and he is guilty of a form of sexual abuse. Morality, brothers and sisters, doesn't change from one generation to another or from one age to another. So what we're not saying here is that Abram is not guilty of anything. We're not saying that they haven't done anything wrong. They have. What we're saying is that as we consider the wrong that they have done, as we consider the sins that they have committed, we have to exercise grace and understanding that they are a product of their times. In general, by the way, that's a good practice. Whenever we consider historical figures, or for that matter, when we consider others outside of our own traditions or outside of our own tribes, it's a healthy practice to be able to, on the one hand, recognize sin for what it is, and on the other hand, to be able to exercise a great measure of grace. I think one of the most ridiculous things that we've seen in current culture that we live in is the way that people on both sides of the political aisle want to change the way we think about our history. So you have some groups of people who look back at our country's history at people who, for example, practiced slavery, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, people like that, and they say because they committed this great sin of racial slavery, therefore none of their contributions should be considered valuable, or we're going to wipe them out of our history books, or we're not going to consider them as having a valuable contribution to society. And they're missing the fact that we have to view people through the lens of their historical context and give them a certain amount of grace because of that. But listen, there are people at the other end of that argument who say that because those people were a product of their times, that they didn't do anything wrong at all. And that's wrong too. That's absurd also. You see, we can say simultaneously that those historical figures, your George Washingtons or your Thomas Jeffersons, that they were sinning. They were doing something wicked. And also recognize that they have valuable contributions to society and that they should be given a certain measure of grace because they were a product of their times. The only people who can't do that are people who don't have the mental acuity to hold two ideas in their head at the same time. That's my personal opinion. Kind of got a little political there, which was not my intention. But getting back to Genesis 16, you see the point that we're trying to make. Abram and Sarai are sinning. They're acting improperly. They're going against the revealed will of God and his marital plans and his sexual ethics. But we have to give them a measure of grace because they were a product of their times. There's sin there. There's sin, though, interestingly, not just in the actions of Abram and Sarai. There's sin even in the heart of Hagar as the story goes forward. As soon as Hagar becomes pregnant, in verse 4, we read, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Now, in order to understand this, you have to, again, kind of place yourself back into this ancient culture and realize that although it was wrong for them to do this, the ancient cultures often viewed women purely for their ability to bear children and valued them for that. That was wrong. They shouldn't have thought of women only in that way, but often they did. And one of the results of that is that women thought of themselves as valuable only to the extent, or at least especially to the extent, that they're able to bear children. And so when one woman is able to bear children and another woman isn't, it became a fairly natural thing for the woman able to bear children to look down her nose a little bit at the woman who was unable to. And that's what we see Hagar doing here. In fact, the original language is a little starker than this translation has it. This says that she looked with contempt on her mistress, but in reality what Moses says in this chapter is that her mistress was despised in her sight. She caused her mistress to be dishonored in her sight, which is a little stronger language, isn't it? This isn't just a subjective thing in the mind of Hagar. It's not just that Hagar is thinking better of herself than of her mistress. It is that Sarai is dishonored because of Hagar. You have to remember, this is an honor-shame culture. This is a culture that considers honor and shame to be the starkest values. Now, we recognize honor and shame as important, but not nearly as important as an honor-shame culture does. We want honor and we don't want shame, but at the end of the day, if we think that somebody doesn't think highly of us, we shake it off and we say, well, who cares about them? I don't care what they think. I'm just going to do me. I'm going to go along with my life and I'm not going to care. That's what we do in our culture. But in that culture, to be dishonored, to be despised is a chief offense. This type of offense is intolerable. To cause anyone dishonor, let alone someone superior, was ground for feuds and recriminations and retaliation. And if it's a dishonor that goes from a servant to a master or mistress, it's ground for punishment. And that's exactly what we see happening here. And as further evidence of this, just consider some of the stories that we've already seen in Genesis. Do you remember the story of Noah and his family after they exited the ark? They left the ark after the flood ended, and Noah planted a vineyard, and he drank the wine, and he got drunk, and he lay naked in his tent, which was a shameful thing, except for in the confines of the marital bed. And his son Ham comes in and sees his nakedness, sees his shame, and rather than covering his nakedness and protecting him from shame, he goes out and mocks him to his brothers. A very similar situation, right? Sinful actions which lead to dishonor. And what happened? Noah curses him. Right? That's an example to you. This is how they thought about this subject of honor and shame. Or perhaps more pertinently to this conversation, remember the language of God's covenant with Abram. Do you remember what God said to Abram in Genesis chapter 12? He said, I will bless you, and I will make you into a great nation, and I will make your name great, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who dishonors you, I will curse. That's what God said to Abram. The one who dishonors you, I will curse. And now we're reading a story of someone dishonoring Abram and his wife, Sarai. So put yourself in the place of the ancient Israelites as they are reading this story, as they're traveling in the wilderness on their way to Canaan. They're reading this story. And they're reading how Hagar dishonors Sarai, and they're reading how Sarai, very appropriately in the thinking of that age, treated her harshly, and Hagar now runs away. And the ancient Israelite, I submit to you, would read that and they would say, too bad, but that was a good story. Period. Let's move on to chapter 17. And it would have made complete sense in their thinking to do that. Hagar got what was coming to her. She dishonored someone, and she suffered the consequences. But the story doesn't end there, does it? It continues. And so as we read the second half of this chapter, brothers and sisters, I encourage you to read it and understand that this is a twist. This is an unexpected ending to this story. Because look at what happens. We read in verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. The angel of the Lord found her. Understand, when we read about the angel of the Lord, more often than not, I think, in the Old Testament, this is a reference not just to some angelic servant of the Lord, but to the Lord himself. That's not absolutely always the case, but I think it very often is. You have to kind of read the whole story to figure out whether this is just an angelic being, a servant, or whether it's a euphemistic way of speaking about God himself. I'm not going to spend time this morning explaining why the Hebrews sometimes did this. It's a complicated discussion and none of you really cares. If you care, you can ask me later. Just take it for granted that this really does happen. The evidence that it's happening in this chapter is a little bit later in verse 13. Glance ahead to verse 13. It says, "So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God of seeing." So up until this point, we see it's the angel of the Lord speaking to her. And then in the verse 13, it says, she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You see? So in other words, Moses is telling us this isn't just an angelic being. He's appearing in the form of an angelic being, but this is God. Understand? This is the Lord. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. It's tempting, isn't it, to just move on to the conversation. But I want you to pause for a minute and consider that statement. The angel of the Lord found her. Understand, God hadn't lost track of her, right? It isn't that God had stopped for a drink himself and ran into her. Oh, fancy meeting you here. That's not it. There's a reason that Moses writes it this way. The angel of the Lord found her. What goes through your mind when you read about one person finding another? What do you have to do before you find someone or something? You have to search. You have to look. That's what we're being told here, brothers and sisters. We're not just being told that the angel of the Lord found her. What we're being told is that the angel of the Lord went out looking for her. And in the mind of the Israelites reading this story, they would have gone, why? Why is God going out looking for this worthless Egyptian runaway slave who dishonored her mistress and master? Why? Because to God, she wasn't worthless. He went out searching for her. The angel of the Lord found her by the spring on the way to Shur, and he says to her, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? Where have you come from, and where are you going? I was reading that this week, that question that the Lord poses to Hagar, and I was remembering, maybe you're thinking of it right now as you hear it. This isn't the only time God asks a question like this, is it? Do you remember Elijah? 1 Kings 19 in the wilderness. Similarly, running away. Running from his trouble. Running from a king and queen who wanted to kill him. Running away from his calling to be a prophetic voice to a wicked power. And God meets him in the wilderness and says, Elijah, what are you doing? Why are you here? Where have you come from? Where are you going? And Hagar responds very transparently, doesn't she? I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. I am running away from my mistress. Hagar does not absolve herself of responsibility, and neither does the Lord. God's concern for his people does not negate the reality of their sin. It is the role of true love to bring imperfection to light so that it can be dealt with properly. Sometimes people don't like talking about sin. Sometimes people think that we talk too much about sin here. But I want to suggest to you that we cannot understand the love of God unless we understand what God says about our sin. God would not be a loving God if he did not confront our sin, just in the same way that a doctor would not be an effective doctor if he didn't recognize the disease in his patient. And furthermore, we will not be able to understand the depth of God's love if we cannot understand the greatness, the vastness of his forgiveness of our sin. We talk about sin a lot because it's a pathway to understanding the depth of the love and the grace of our God. God confronts Hagar in his gentle way with her own sin, or rather he forces her to confront her own sin. She says, I'm running away, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. And the Lord tells her what she needs to do. He gives her a mission. The angel of the Lord said to her, verse 9, return to your mistress and submit to her. He gives her a mission. She must return be an example. She must return and testify to what God has done in her life. I wonder if the Lord's interaction with Hagar here serves as a model for Paul later in the New Testament when Paul deals with a runaway slave too. Remember the story of Onesimus in the book of Philemon? Paul will tell that runaway slave to do the same thing that the Lord here says to Hagar, return, submit. But he doesn't just tell her to return and submit, he gives her a hope. Look at what he says in these verses that follow. The angel of the Lord says to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude, which should strike you as familiar, right? That language is eerily similar to the language of God's promise to Abram. God is treating this Gentile slave, this Egyptian servant, with the same covenant promise with which he served the patriarch. And God reveals his nature to Hagar in these verses. His nature as it is bound up in the name that he divinely appoints for her unborn child. The angel of the Lord says to her in verse 11, you are pregnant and you shall bear a son and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Now in English we don't really see the connection between the name that he gives her for her son and what he says about himself. But there is one in Hebrew. He says, his name shall be Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. The Hebrew word for listened or hears is the word Shammai. El Shammai. Ishmael. Do you hear it? He's saying, his name will be Ishmael because I am El Shammai, the God who hears. The God who hears, the God who listens. God is revealing to Hagar that he is a God who hears, that he is a God who is concerned about his children, even those whom the rest of the world might see as merely minor characters. God still hears them and sees them and cares for them. God hears you. Even when you think you're alone, and you think that you're by yourself, and you think that nobody else cares, God hears. He sees. He gives Hagar some promises about Ishmael. He says he's going to be a wild donkey of a man, which sounds kind of insulting to us, but in the context, all he's saying is he's going to be strong and resilient. And there's going to be trouble, there's going to be conflict, but he's going to be a strong man, and he'll survive. God reveals a heart of concern for Hagar. And this leads to Hagar demonstrating and then passing on a heritage of experiencing God's compassion to future generations. Consider the heritage of compassion that Hagar passes on. In the last few verses of this chapter, we see Hagar passing on a heritage of God's compassion through the bestowing of 3 names. We see her name God, and we see her name the well that this all takes place at, and then we see how she and Abram together name their son. In verse 13, Hagar gives a name to the Lord. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. Probably you have a footnote that renders that in transliterated English from the Hebrew as El Roi. Maybe you've done a study on the names of God in the past, and if so, this is probably one of the ones you've studied. El Roi. He is the God who sees, or the God who sees me. It's a name that corresponds to what God has just said to her in conjunction with the name of Ishmael. He is a God who hears. I am El Shammai, the God who hears. And she says, you are El Shammai, you are El Roi, the God who sees and hears. It's the same idea, you see. You're the God who sees. Have you ever felt unseen? Have you ever felt unvalued? Brothers and sisters, this is speaking to you. He is El Roi, the God who sees. And by the way, it's worth pointing out that this means that Hagar is the only woman in the entirety of biblical revelation who is accorded the honor of bestowing a name on the Lord. Isn't that interesting? This runaway Egyptian slave. El Roi, you are the God who sees. She bestows a name on God in that way. She bestows a name on the well in testimony of this fact. Verse 14, therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai Roi, the well of the ever-living one who sees me. It's a testimonial name. It's a name that reminds everyone who comes there of what happened there. You're supposed to imagine generations of locals coming to this well. Remember, Moses is writing this some probably 400 years maybe after the events that he's describing. People kind of do the chronology in different ways, but maybe 200, maybe 400 years after the fact. And you're supposed to imagine hundreds of years, generation after generation of people coming to this well, of mothers coming with their children to this well, mothers saying to their children, we're going to gather up the flocks, we're going to gather up our little herds, and we're going to go to Be'er Lahai Roi and get water. And the children say, why is it called that? And the mothers say, let me tell you a story. There was a woman once who was down and out, all by herself. She thought no one saw her. She thought no one was on her side. But God, the living one, saw her and heard her and cared for her. Moses goes on to add a parenthetical note here, an editorial note. He says, this well lies between Kadesh and Bered. He's telling his readers, his people, the Israelites, as they travel through the wilderness, he's saying, if you want to go and visit the well where this happened, here's how you get there. You take this highway and you go to this crossroads and you turn left at that big tree that fell over 7 years ago, and you're going to find the well. Right? And his point is, it's still there. The well has persisted to this day, and the name of the well has persisted to this day. It's a real story. This is the historicity of the story, but it's also a testimony to the endurance of Hagar's testimony. She names the Lord. She names the well, and she names her son. The story ends with Hagar returning, as the Lord told her to do. She obeys. She returns to Abram and Sarai. She bears her son, and they call him Ishmael. Interestingly, it says that Abram named him Ishmael, which I take to mean that Hagar has done what she was called to do. She's told Abram and Sarai the story. She's told them about the God that she encountered. And Abram, as he hears the story, recognizes that she has encountered the same God that he has followed from Ur of the Chaldees, the same God who promised him that he would be the father of many nations. He recognizes in her a worshiper of the same God that he recognized in Melchizedek a few chapters ago. He sees the kindredness there, and he recognizes the truth of it. And so he is easily persuaded to give the name to this son that she says God said to. They name him Ishmael. Hagar obeyed God, returned into a bad situation, and testified to God's care, God's goodness, and God's grace. Actually, as I read this, I wonder, can we do the same? Are we courageous enough to do the same? Hagar was called to return to a bad situation and testify to God's care. Can we go into the relatively easy situations of our lives, our workplaces, our families, our neighborhoods, and testify to God's care and concern? She's an example to us in that way, isn't she? She's not a minor character at all. There are no minor characters in God's story. He sees and he cares for each of us, and he uses each of us as Hagar in his plan. Friends, you have been seen by God. He has come searching for you, just like he went out searching for Hagar. He has compassion on you, though you may feel alone, disowned, poorly used. You are not alone. You are not unseen or unheard. God sees you and he cares for you. He has loved you so much that he provided not only means of sustenance, but he provided something much better, didn't he? You see, as we read this story, we are slapped in the face with the sinfulness of the people involved. We cannot read this without seeing the sinfulness of Abram and Sarai. Even the sinfulness of Hagar is here in the story. And beyond that, behind that, we see the sinfulness of the culture and the brokenness of the world that makes their sin in their eyes seem normal. The world is broken. And we see in this a reflection of our own reality, don't we? We see our own sinfulness and we see the brokenness of our own world. And yet in the midst of this sinful, broken story, God still appears to speak to this scared mother-to-be, this frightened woman who's all by herself, and He still is able to say to her that all will be well. He is still able to say to her that He cares for her, that He's going to do great things in her. Why can He do that? How can God have the gall to speak into that situation and say it's going to be okay? It's because His redemptive plan is still at work. God's plan was announced from the beginning, and it is proceeding even here. It's proceeding even here. God's redemptive plan, which would eventually culminate in one of Abraham's descendants, Jesus Christ, coming. And by the way, Jesus Himself shows a remarkable care and concern for women who are despised by their societies, women who are hurting, the most vulnerable. Interesting, isn't it? Jesus comes and His deepest expression of concern for those hurting women is not just to meet their physical needs or care for them emotionally or psychologically. His deepest expression of concern for their needs is to die for their sins. That's what He does. He dies for their sins, and He dies for the sins of the world. He dies for the brokenness in the world. He takes the broken world, the broken society, the sinful corruption that characterizes our culture, and He bore it with Him down into the grave in death. And He left it there when He rose 3 days later. He destroyed it, and He is destroying it. That's what the gospel tells us, isn't it? This is what Jesus has accomplished for us. He has accomplished for us the potential of a new life. He has accomplished for us a new world. He has repaired this broken world. He is the God who sees us. He is the God who cares for us. Jesus is the God who came searching for us. Isn't that amazing? You are no minor character in God's story. He's placed His love on you and come searching for you. He's given His body and blood for your salvation. Give thanks to Him. Glorify Him for His care. Worship Him because He is a God who sees you, who cares for you.